Welcome to this third and final lecture on chapter 26, where we're looking at Africa and the Atlantic world. And in this section, we're going to be looking at the African diaspora, which is section 3. The word diaspora refers to disperse, to spread around the world. So when we talk about the African diaspora, we are talking about Africans who are living in other parts of the world. So it's when a group of people leave their original homeland and begin to go to other parts of the world, or in this case, they're being taken by force to other parts of the world. So just like when we studied the Indian Ocean, we talked about diasporic communities when merchants like Arab merchants went to go live and permanently stay in Southeast Asia or in the Indian Ocean, like along India or other parts of the Indian Ocean basin. Those are diasporic communities. So we're looking at the diaspora, the African diaspora, or refer to Africans in diaspora. Even today, some African Americans refer to themselves as Africans in diaspora, right? Who are now living in other parts outside of their original homeland. And so this is because of the slave trade, right? So you can see the destination from this pie chart. And half of the slaves were going to the Caribbean islands. And that's because of the brutality of the work and the high mortality. Rather than taking good care of the people that were being enslaved, people were dying at high rates, so they were just constantly bringing slaves over from Africa. And then another big chunk is going to Brazil, and the remainder to Central and South America. Only a small percentage are going to North America, so to what is today the United States, right? So this is because of the growing plantations and the fertile lands in the Americas. So on the plantations, right, you have the people that they're living there, they're interacting with each other. So most Africans are living on plantations, either in tropical or subtropical regions. And you're seeing mixing of people from different parts of Africa. And that's gonna impact language, because there's gonna be plantations where not everybody could speak to each other, and that was done sometimes on purpose to keep people from working with each other to plan a revolt, right? So they're gonna be speaking the language of the colonial power who owns that plantation, mixed in with their words from their different African languages. And so the reason is most people are working for producing cash crops. So the cultivation of tobacco, of rice, of indigo, that's used for like dyeing things blue. Cotton, which was in high demand in a growing industrial era in the United States and in Europe. Coffee is another thing that was planted in Brazilian and Central American plantations. So slave labor kept the costs low. And there was a sharp racial division of labor. So this is again going back to what I've been talking about, the birth of modern racism. That played a role in the way work was done. And usually the slaves that were mixed with Europeans and they had lighter skin, they got different positions. They got slightly better treatment. They didn't have the harshest of jobs. So skin color and skin tone begins to take a role. And even on a plantation where there was indigenous people and mestizos, right? There's a sharp racial division of labor. And that was a practice that was introduced by the Spaniards. So there's going to be regional differences, okay? In the Caribbean and in South America, because of the climate, it's different than in North America. Slaves are going to fall victims to malaria, to yellow fever. The hard and brutal conditions of sugar plantations are going to lead to lower standards of sanitation, nutrition, and lower standards of living. So there's going to be more mortality. There's also low rates of reproduction because most of the slaves that are being taken are men. So they're not reproducing, so they're constantly bringing slaves from Africa. So they're importing a continuous stream. And like I said before, half went to the Caribbean, a third to Brazil. North America only accounted for 5% of the slaves, and disease was less threatening there. The conditions were less harsh, and they imported larger number of females in the British colonies because they encouraged families, and that was done to keep the costs low because people are here reproducing. And so in North America, you're going to see a different set of conditions. And you could see the effects today. If you look at the populations of Brazil and the Caribbean, they are much more African um, in their ancestry than in the United States, right, where we have a much smaller African American population. So there was resistance. It wasn't like people were just accepting the conditions. Okay, there had been revolts and other ways of resisting. Many resisted servitude. So some resistance was mild, but it was costly, like sabotage, right? Working slow, running away, messing with the machines, all of that, so that the production, so the profits would not be as high. So those were some ways people resisted. Um, Other ways were running away and creating their own societies, what are called maroon societies. Now, I forgot who it was, but there was a comedian speaking. I think it might have been Dave Chappelle. But talking about this whole stereotype of people that they're lazy. They were sitting around the plantation. He's like, yeah, because they were slaves. Like they didn't want to do the work. It wasn't like they're going to be happy, doing this really harsh work. So some ways of resistance was by not working. It wasn't being lazy. It was you're resisting. You're like, no, I'm not going to do this thing you're forcing me to do. And there was other ways. There was other revolts as well. So real armed revolts. In the United States, there's a famous Nat Turner revolt that took place in the 1700s. You had revolts in Haiti, and most of these were revolts that were crushed, and then people were severely punished. But there was a case in the French colony of Saint-Domingue where there is a slave revolt that becomes a successful revolt, and that's the revolt in Haiti that leads to the independence of Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture. And that was happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So while France is in the midst of the revolution, the ideas that the French are using to justify their revolution are then taken by the people in Haiti to revolt against the French. And we'll study that in the chapter when we study the independence movements in the Americas. But you should understand, and I think this is one of the things where we often don't make this connection. We talk about slavery as something that happened in the past, but don't really acknowledge the economic development that came because of it, right? The reason why the countries that today are wealthy, people like the British, like the Dutch, like the Americans, they profited because of slavery. Like these societies, here you see in this picture, we see the city of London, we see Amsterdam, we see Paris, we see New York, right? These were the bustling cities, the wealthy cities of this era. And a lot of that wealth was because of slavery, right? The Industrial Revolution and the factories that were making England and the United States industrial powers, right? Manufacturing textiles were benefiting from free labor in the cotton plantations in the south of the United States and as well as other parts of the world. So the money, the profit that was being generated to invest in infrastructure, to invest in technology when that time comes from the fact that people were not paying workers that were making these countries rich. So even, the White House was built by slave labor. And so that's something to it's really important to understand that what you're going to study in the later chapters, right, is not happening in isolation. When you read chapter 30, it's not just like that it's happening at that time. It is connected to what had been going on for the centuries before that generated the wealth for these European countries. And then the last thing it talks about in the chapter is about the making of African American cultural traditions, the mixing of cultures that are going to come about because of slavery. So in American studies, we had a lot of mixed cultures. People were mixing Native, European, and then Africans from many different parts of Africa. So European languages dominated slave societies because they were not being given the same language. Okay, so African traditions become hard to preserve. The ships mixed Africans from different regions. In the American societies, they mixed the cultures. So Creole languages emerge, which are a mix of European and ancestry. And you can see this image here, right, with or has words like who and in Creole it's qui est, which is also influenced by French, right? So what, qui ça, when, qui l'est. So Creole is still spoken there in the Caribbean and in parts of South America today. There is also a blending of religion and syncretism that takes place. African people came with their indigenous traditions from Africa, with their native religions, but they were on plantations that were predominantly Christian and mostly Catholic. So sometimes they were being forced to adopt Catholicism. Other times they mixed Catholicism with their religion and with the religion of the native people that they interacted with on the plantations. So they combine religious elements on the plantations to develop their own versions. There was no institutionalized religion with hierarchies. They don't have priests, but we see religions that still are present and thriving today, including Santeria in places like Cuba in the Caribbean. We see in Jamaica things like Vodou, or what we call voodoo. In Brazil, you see what you see here, people dancing in a circle, and that's candomblé, is another syncretic religion. So they're taking Christianity and mixing it with the African religious and beliefs, the beliefs in spirits of nature and magic, right? So that combined to create syncretic religions, and you should be able to know that. You should be able to articulate the syncretism. And we talked a little bit about in chapter 25 the Virgen de Guadalupe as a syncretic element of religion, right? So the similar things are happening with the indigenous people. And so we see the roots of African American cultural traditions, the crops that Africans bring with them, like okra, right? Introduced in dishes that emerge in the South and in the Caribbean, like gumbo, in the form of art, in dance and music. The roots of modern hip hop and rap are from the storytelling, the oral traditions when people were not allowed to write and they passed on stories and messages. And that comes from the griot culture that we had read about before, right? The oral telling of stories and the use of drum beats, right, to tell the stories. So that's where a lot of the modern, the real roots of modern hip hop and a lot of modern music in general. And so the slave trade starts to come to an end by the late 1800s, or within the early 1800s it begins. So throughout the 1800s is when we're going to see the end of the slave trade. And first we're going to see the end of the slave trade, but the practice of slavery will continue until the abolishment of slavery. And it was influenced by abolitionists, people, that were calling for it to be ended, people who were developing a conscience, seeing how Africans were being treated. Now, you remember we haven't studied this, but you might have learned this in middle school, that in the 1700s, the United States, for example, is beginning to take shape, where they're studying Enlightenment ideas, all people being created equal, everybody having unalienable rights. So in those debates and in those conversations, people are looking at, well, what about African people? And there had been African people who had escaped and went to a place where they could be free, they could be educated, and they're also telling their story. And so one of those people was Olaudah Equiano. And he was a West African who published an autobiography that detailed his experiences as a slave and as a free man, right? So he'd been captured as a child, sold into slavery, worked in the West Indies in Virginia and Pennsylvania, right? And eventually he writes a book and it becomes used to argue against slavery. And you can see one of his quotes here, right? When you make men slaves, you deprive them of half their virtue. You set them in your own conduct. An example of fraud, rapine, and cruelty, and compel them to live with you in a state of war. And so we're going to be looking at more quotes from him in class, and there's also one in the textbook that you're going to be working on a Hippos chart with, where he talks about the Middle Passage. Okay, so the economic costs of slavery played a role besides the Enlightenment ideas, besides people developing a conscience for treating people as humans. There were also economic factors that were tied to this, because it was becoming expensive. You know, it gradually was not cheap as practices. You know, you began to end the slave trade when the British abolished the slave trade in the early 1800s. There could be no more ships coming across, and so people had to start making sure that the slaves they had were well taken care of, that were well fed, that their children grew up healthy, right? So they could continue to have slaves. So that cost people, right? Providing them houses, providing them with better food. And then as sugar cultivation expands and the price declines of sugar, the profit margins from sugar are also not as high. And so people begin to realize that they could actually just pay wages for the work, and it's cheaper to pay somebody a small wage than it is to maintain them and their family. So that is also going to play a role in why slavery is going to come to an end. So like here in the United States, right, during the Civil War, it wasn't that the people in the North were not racist and they didn't believe in slavery. It's that they had industrial factories, and in the factories it was cheaper to pay minimum wage than it was to have slaves, right? Buy and maintain slaves. So Denmark abolishes the slave trade in 1803. Britain does it in 1807, and since the British are a powerful navy at the time, they're going to have a big influence. The U.S. will follow suit in 1808. The French banned slave trading in 1814, the Dutch in 1817, and the Spanish in 1845. So there was a case of a ship that the Spaniards, it was a Spanish ship, the Amistad, that was, I believe there was a revolt. There was, on there. There was a revolt. The people revolted. And then I think the ship got caught in a storm. I don't remember the exact story, but it ends up in the United States. So because the U.S. had already abolished the slave trade and the ship landed in the United States, then the slaves were allowed to go free. But then the Spanish owners of the ship sued and said, no, it's our cargo. It's legal in our country. Give them back. Right? So this was a big legal case, the Amistad case. And eventually the United States ruled that the slave trade is illegal, therefore they're not going to send them back into slavery. But despite the slave trade being illegal, slavery itself and owning slaves remained legal. And clandestine trading, right, smuggling continues till 1867. And then we begin to see the emancipation of slaves, beginning with in the British colonies by 1883. The French in 1848. Brazil abolishes slavery in 1888. They're the last ones to abolish slavery. The United States abolished it during the Civil War in 1865. Mexico had abolished it in the 1830s. And then Saudi Arabia and Angola continued to have slavery into the 1960s. So a long legacy of the slave trade. So this goes on for centuries, and in those centuries, it shapes people's views on race. It has psychological impacts, not only for the people that were a part of it, but for their descendants. And there was the economic growth, right? That the countries that were benefiting the most became very profitable and used a lot of their wealth to invest in creating more wealth and became powerful countries. And this is a discussion that people still have today. Just the other day in the newspaper, they were advertising there's going to be an online discussion on reparation payments, on should people alive today that are descendants of slaves be compensated, or should there be compensations for African American communities in the US to make up for the centuries that their ancestors had been exploited. And it's a controversial issue. But people are looking at it today of how do we repair, right? How do we kind of make amends for benefiting, right? Using people to benefit from them without them benefiting, right? All of this work that was being done to the benefit of Europeans was at the expense of Africans who did not seek any benefit from it. And that comes up when people discuss reparations today. They say, well, people alive today, they didn't earn it. They didn't work. They're not the ones who did the labor, right? And people that support reparations will say, well, but the people who did do the labor, they didn't benefit from it. So it's kind of, there's different debates on should people just get money, or should there be investment in, college scholarships and job creation programs and other things to try to make up for the legacies of slavery, at least here in the United States. And there's other countries who look at that as well. So that is it for this chapter. That discussion will be a discussion for a later day. But make sure you understand, and if you have any questions that you bring them to class and that you ask me. Okay? So that is it for chapter 26. Okay? This weekend you will have chapter 27. I'll see you in class.